Hi, my name is Gerard Lordahl, and I'm a horticulturist with the Council on the Environment of New York City. I'm going to be talking to you this afternoon about container gardening. And what you see in front of you are a whole assortment of materials, a small selection of plants, as well as some information that you, as a city gardener, might find helpful in container gardening right here in New York City. In a previous show, we talked about building the actual boxes, and I have some samples of containers that you yourself can build at home. You can see some of them are around me on the tables. They're made of a variety of materials. Most of them here are wood. This one in particular is the appropriate size for a window box for us here in the city. Before I get into any of the specifics regarding building the box, I want to precaution you about the hazards of window box gardening. You must make sure that whatever container you build and put out on a windowsill, you must make sure that it is completely secured on the window, just like you secure an air conditioner. There are certain codes that we have to abide by with the buildings department to ensure that your window box does not fall off the sill. One of the techniques that people use is to attach on the window box eye hooks on the sides, as this box has on the front table, that you could then wire to the sill so that in case of a strong gusty wind, the window box would not fall off of the sill. The other concern that many gardeners have is the amount of water that falls out of the container and drips onto the sill or onto people walking under the window. So what has been suggested in many cases is to put the holes on one side of the window box so that it drains properly. And you could see here in this particular box the collection of holes and also the legs on the bottom of the window box that will cause the water to drain, and you can have some control over where the drip is. Another suggestion for the window box itself is to line it with plastic to catch any excess water that would fall through. Those are just a couple of tips about the actual building of the box. What I'm going to be talking to you a little further about is the type of plant material, the type of material to use to prepare your soil mix, how to maintain the window box, and a small selection of plants that I would recommend for window boxes as well as larger containers. When we talk about container gardening, it doesn't just limit us to the windowsill. Many of you as city gardeners are lucky enough to have maybe a backyard space and also some space where containers can be used to maximize the amount of garden space that you may have. You may have a terrace, you may have a rooftop garden, you may just have a front porch. All of these areas can be used as garden spaces. Even though you may not have in-ground land to develop on, you can use containers. Well, what kind of containers? They don't have to be wood. They don't have to sit on your windowsill. They could be containers that are made of things that you maybe have discarded or things that you have in the basement that you're no longer using. Many community gardeners around the city who don't have large budgets will use bathtubs, old sinks, any plastic container, possibly from a school kitchen. You'd be surprised at the creativity that a lot of people use as far as what container to use. It doesn't just have to be the standard plastic or clay pot. The important thing, though, to consider is that all of the containers must have some kind of drainage. And here you see a regular 6-inch plastic pot and the importance of having holes for the water to remove itself from the container so the roots do not rot. I showed you in the window box the holes that are required for that kind of container, and it stands the same for any other container that you use. Drainage is of utmost importance. Many gardeners will call me at the Council on the Environment and ask what the problem is. They have an outdoor shrub or a tree or perennials, and it doesn't look too great. It's starting to turn black or yellow, and what might the problem be? Many cases it's overwatering, and they don't have sufficient drainage holes. Those of you who do houseplant gardening, you're familiar with the clay pots and the holes underneath the clay pots. And this is also excellent for plants as far as drainage goes. Many people will use a saucer underneath these types of pots to collect the water so it doesn't fall on a precious rug or make a mess in the house. The same thing can be applied to outdoor plants. So drainage is of utmost importance. The other thing is, with container gardens, they're more susceptible to drying out than the typical average in-ground garden. And that's because the root surface, or the amount of root space that the plant has, is limited, as you can see in this window box. And also, it's susceptible to a lot more heat because it's above the ground. It's not protected by the adjoining soil. And it also has to deal with a lot of wind in many cases. Many of us are gardeners on terraces or rooftops where the wind can really dry out or desiccate the roots as well as the leaves of the plant and cause damage. So I'll be talking to you about a couple of things that you can do to compensate for those sorts of problems. If you do have a container, whatever size, whatever shape, whatever material you use, whether it's wood, whether it's concrete, whether it's fiberglass, whether it's plastic, you need to put in a layer of drainage. So I have a sample here of materials that you can use, and my sample right here is simply crushed stone that you could get at any hardware or garden center, or many people will choose to take old clay pots and break up the clay pots that maybe are already broken and use them in the bottom of a window box or container as a source of drainage. Another recommendation is to take pieces of the clay pot, and I'll use the pine bark to demonstrate this, and place pieces of clay pots or shards over the holes of the container so that you don't get a lot of water gushing out, nor do you get a lot of soil running through these holes. So it's an important step to cover the holes of the containers with a piece of clay pot or a large stone so that lots of soil doesn't run through, nor lots of water. So what you would want to do after your box is built or your container is placed in a location in your garden where you would like to grow some containerized plants, you would put a layer of pebbles on the bottom surface, and it's usually recommended to put about an inch or so of rocks or pebbles on the bottom of the pot to allow for extra drainage. And you can see how pebbles are falling through those holes even now, and you can imagine the amount of soil that will fall through if you don't cover those holes with a piece of clay pot. The other thing that I would recommend is to put a small amount of horticultural charcoal right on top of that layer of gravel or chip. And what that does is filter out any impurities that you might have in the soil and will prevent the box or the container from having an odor. Some of you may have a problem with your container or your box that there's a stagnant smell coming from it. It could be that you haven't provided enough drainage for the water to run through, and to rectify that problem, what you can do is put some garden charcoal, which is the same as aquarium charcoal or similar, and you could buy it at most garden centers. The charcoal acts as a filter system and will pick up any impurities as you water that are caught through the soil, and will prevent any odor in the soil as well. So these are two important steps to make sure that you put a good layer of drainage on the bottom of the container, and on top of that layer of drainage to make sure that you have a layer of charcoal to filter out any impurities and prevent odor in the box. The most important thing when you're putting together a container, whether it's a window box, whether it's a fiberglass container for a tree, whether it's a concrete container, is the soil mix. Those of you who have rooftop gardens, and I know there are many of you here in New York City, you must consider the weight of the soil for rooftops. And as I said earlier regarding the safety of window boxes, there's also a building code for weight or load weight on city buildings. The amount of weight you are allowed for a rooftop garden is about 30 pounds per square foot. So you must make sure that you don't have a heavy load on the rooftop that could cause cracking in the roof or leaks for the apartment below. You must also make sure that you check with the landlord or the owner of the building and get permission to do this if you do not own the building. A good mix for any kind of container is equal parts peat moss, which I have sampled here, vermiculite, which I have sampled here, and a topsoil. Equal parts can be anything. They can be quart containers, they can be a simple clay pot, but equal parts peat moss, vermiculite, and topsoil are generally a good mix for most containers. When you're dealing with a rooftop site, or when you want to use a light mix, you would go with a soil-less mix. And that means that there is no topsoil. It is basically an artificial mix of soil. And when I say artificial, I mean mostly peat moss, vermiculite, or perlite. There's no heavy topsoil that will create a lot of load weight on the roof. So for those of you who are rooftop gardeners and are worried about the weight of the soil, use a soilless mix, which, as I said, is peat moss, vermiculite, and perlite. But either a soilless mix or a soil mix, you could put those three parts in equal proportions together and get a good soil mixture for your container. The vermiculite that I mentioned, for those of you who are familiar with it, vermiculite is a mica derived from a mica mineral, and you could tell the difference between vermiculite and perlite by gently squeezing it. When you squeeze vermiculite, it will bounce back like a sponge. And it is very similar to a sponge in soil because it absorbs a lot of moisture and it holds on to nutrients, and that's what makes it a very important amendment to a container mix. Perlite, on the other hand, is found in this mix of soil that I have, and when you crush perlite, or when you put pressure on perlite, it actually disintegrates. So that's how you could distinguish perlite from vermiculite. Perlite does not provide any nutrients to the soil. It basically aerates the soil, which means that if you have a very heavy topsoil or a potting soil and you find that your plants aren't doing as well, you might want to add some perlite. Perlite comes to us from volcanic rock, and it's puffed up at a very high temperature to create these air spaces that will then provide aeration and water for your soil mix. So those are two amendments to the soil that are very important, whether you're doing outdoor containers or even houseplants. Another amendment is regular horticultural sand. And you could find this at most garden centers. And if you're using, or if you're planning on putting in plants that require a sandy soil mix or a lighter soil mix, you would want to incorporate a certain amount, usually equal parts, of sand into the mixture as well. So that gives you a basic background of the soil amendments. We have our soilless mix, we have our peat moss, which I failed to mention, acts similar in a sense to the vermiculite in holding water moisture and is also organic and provides nutrients in the soil as well. So we have our sample of peat moss, which is organic. We have our soilless mix, which is a mixture of vermiculite, perlite, and peat moss. We have vermiculite. We have our sand, our horticultural sand for good drainage. We have our stones or shards of clay for extra drainage above the base of the container. And we also have our charcoal for filtering out any impurities. I have another material on the table that I think is very important, actually two samples, and that is pine bark chipped or nuggets and shredded bark mulch. When we talk about containers, we also have to keep in mind that watering is often the biggest problem with containerized plants. As I said before, the environment of the plant is restricted to the four walls or the confines of the round tub or whatever container you're using, and the water can dry out and run out very quickly, and it can be dried out also by the wind and the high temperatures. So what you can do to ensure that the water remains in the soil is to cover the surface with a mulch. This is shredded bark chip mulch that I prefer many times for smaller containers because it has a finer size to it, and it doesn't take away from the plant very often. The pine bark chip is often used for larger plantings or tubs, maybe the size of this table, 2 feet by 4 feet or so, and often for larger plant materials that won't take away from the beauty of the tree. It also comes in smaller nuggets, so you don't have to go with the very large nuggets. What that layer of mulch does is it provides moisture, and it also keeps the weeds down, and it also will help temper the soil so there isn't a lot of fluctuating between the plants, the temperature of the plants, and cause damage. And that's another point that I wanted to bring up. There are a lot of products that you can use at the garden center that will prevent the plants from desiccating. And one of them is an oil solution, and there are many different brands you could use, but in the fall, very often when the temperature is around 40 degrees, for those of you who have broadleaf evergreens like rhododendrons, azaleas, hollies, and you're finding that your containerized trees and shrubs are drying out and get burned from winter damage, in the fall when the temperature is about 40 degrees, you could spray an anti-desiccant. That will put a coating of oil or wax or paraffin onto the leaves, and that will prevent a lot of water loss. Also use burlap as a windscreen. If you're on the 24th floor of a terrace or on the rooftop and you get a very cold, strong wind, put up a windscreen of burlap, and that will help block some of the wind that will prevent desiccation. I wanted to show you a couple of samples of plant material. I couldn't bring all of them, but a couple of containerized plants that you might want to consider is hosta. This is a perennial. It comes up every year, and it's very nice, and it's very well adapted to containers. While I have the hosta in my hand, I want to demonstrate how you would remove a plant from a container for planting. You would open up the palm of your hand, place your hand over the pot, and put the plant in between your fingers, tip the pot upside down, gently squeeze it back and forth, bang it a couple of times, and the pot should loosen up from the roots, as so, and you should remove the whole root ball as it is. Now, the mistake that many people make is they usually take it at this stage and shake off the soil. That's not the correct thing to do. You want to disturb this root ball as little as possible. And you can see the roots are just waiting to be put into a larger container of this hosta. So this would be the proper way to remove a plant from its container without disturbing the plant roots and causing the plant to go into shock. With containers, it's also very important to do some root pruning. So as part of good maintenance, what is recommended is to, every now and then, as with this chrysanthemum, to try and get down into the soil of the container and prune off some of the roots. And here you could see a good example of pot-bound roots of this chrysanthemum. What you would want to do is get a good pair of pruning shears and remove the roots, because if the roots become too pot-bound, that would put a stress on the plant itself. So root pruning is a good technique for any container, any kind of containerized plant, whether it's a tree, whether it's a shrub, or whether it's a herbaceous perennial like this chrysanthemum. Some of the annuals that are planted in window boxes or containerized gardens are not as well suited because of the incredible moisture content that they require. Something like impatiens that many of you know of in the city, because it's very well suited for heavy shade, is also a moisture-loving plant. So for containers, if you choose a plant that is moisture-loving, like impatiens, like the hosta that I showed you earlier, you want to make sure that you definitely mulch it, and you also want to make sure that you keep it well watered. Those of you who are doing extensive rooftop gardening, a trickle irrigation system or a watering system in ground is often very highly recommended. They're not that expensive. For a couple of $100s, you could have your whole rooftop area usually set up with a timer system that will allow water to trickle through wires that will give your plants a good amount of water so that you don't have to be watering every day or twice every day in the heat of the summer on rooftops. So that's a very good consideration. Consider herbs also. My sample of herbs for containers is basil, which is an annual, grows very easily from seed. And I would strongly recommend herbs in window boxes if you are limited to windowsills, and basil would be a great one for a window box, as well as parsley if you're just starting out. So there are a whole assortment of plants, including trees and shrubs, that you could put in containers. Again, on maintenance, be sure, as a protection from winter hardiness, that you have at least about 12 inches of soil around the roots of the plants to protect them in the wintertime. This is important, as I said earlier, because the roots need to be protected from freezing. And if you are planning to put in large trees or shrubs on your rooftop or terrace, make sure that the container is big enough to allow at least 12 to 14 inches of soil that will act as insulation around the root ball so that you won't get winter freezing of the roots and that your plants can continue to carry on through the season beyond winter. For those of you who would like a recommendation for a good book that will cover a lot of these topics, I recommend Linda Yang's book, City Gardener's Handbook from Balcony to Backyard. And she really does a good job of pointing out what it's like to garden in New York City in containers, and she describes the process. She recommends various containers and designs and plant material as well. Not only Linda's book, there are other books that you might want to look for in the library, but there's an assortment of information out there from the botanical gardens, from the horticultural societies, and from organizations like myself who could give you information on containerized gardens, how to build the boxes, what plants to select, etc. When I talk about plant selection, it's also very important to make sure that you take a sun study of the area where you want to put your containers. Determine how much sun the area is getting. And basically what we're talking about is a shaded area would be considered an area that gets 4 hours or less of direct sunlight. So an area in the garden or on the terrace that gets anywhere between 6 and 8 would be considered partial shade or sun, and anything above 8 hours is considered basically direct sunlight. So choose your plants according to the amount of sunlight that you get. And what we recommend is to go out and take a look at the space before you plant and draw a line or get a mental picture of where the shadows are falling and how long the sun stays up to a certain point in your garden. And if you know that across your balcony 3 hours of direct sunlight a day comes to that area, that would basically be a very low shade area, and you would want to go to things like English ivy or pachysandra possibly as a ground cover, and low light trees maybe like birch. As far as a recommendation of small trees, many people want to know what small trees will do well on rooftops and terraces or in containers. We found that crab apples do very well as small trees. We've also found that some of the small dogwoods, like the Korean dogwood, Cornus kousa, will do well. As far as the evergreens go, they're very tolerant of dry conditions. Juniper are excellent for rooftops. They're usually native to the seashore. They require very less moisture than most plants, so I would recommend junipers, some of the smaller pines, the mugo pine. I would also recommend taxus or the yew as a evergreen as well. Any of the evergreens that have needles will be able to control their water loss better than the broadleaf evergreens like rhododendrons, like the hollies. So if you have rhododendron or hollies or any of the broadleaf evergreens, you may want to prepare to protect them in the winter from any damage. And the damage that you would see would be brown tips in the early spring or whole leaves that have died out because of the excessive wind and also the excessive drought conditions through the fall. It's August, and it would be recommended this time of year to thoroughly water your containers all through and up until frost. And that will enable as much water to be absorbed by the roots. Even though the air temperature may be much colder than indoors, the soil temperature outdoors is often warmer, so that the roots are still growing even though the air temperature outdoors is close to freezing. So continue watering your containers all up till frost. As far as fertilizing, it's not recommended this time of year, which is late summer, early fall, to fertilize your trees or shrubs any longer. The reason is because the fertilizing may encourage new growth that'll cause that is more susceptible to winter damage. So the only fertilizer you may want to use is a high phosphorus, bone meal type fertilizers, things that will stimulate good root development and help that plant overwinter from the summer and the fall into the next spring. Any of the annuals, like the impatiens that I showed you, or the basil, any of the plants that are flowering for you now and that are showy, the fertilizer that you could use would be a water-soluble fertilizer, something that would be taken up quick with, as I said, a high phosphorus. A general good recommendation is 5-10-5, that kind of analysis. Those three numbers refer to the percent of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which is a good balanced fertilizer for most plants. As far as insect and pest control, general house cleaning is very helpful. And when you're container gardening, you are still susceptible to pests and diseases. Clean up any standing water. Remove any dead leaves or foliage. A good soap insecticide is recommended often. It's not toxic, and it can be applied to the surface of the leaves of most plants. Check the label because there are some that are sensitive to it, and that can help you control your insects. Container gardening can be very rewarding. Don't feel that because you live in the city in an apartment and maybe just have a small terrace or just a windowsill that you cannot do any gardening. You can, and you can do it successfully following the tips that I have given you. And if you need any more information, you could call us at the Council on the Environment. We're at area code 212-788-7928. And as a nonprofit here in New York City, we cater to community gardeners and also to block associations, churches, schools, and we could help answer most of your garden and plant questions.
Citizen street tree pruners, struggling to make the Big Apple as green as possible.
We rely heavily on volunteers because, as most people know in the city, the Parks Department, who has jurisdiction over the 700,000 street trees in New York City, have been severely cut recently with their budget, and they don't have the staff to go out and maintain the trees. So it's up to the volunteers, the citizen pruner volunteers, to work in their particular neighborhoods to take care of the trees.
It's not an easy job. These volunteers say the city's young trees are in abysmal shape, with an average lifespan of only 7 years. Their untended branches get hit by trucks and cars, the soil fills up with trash and cigarette butts, eventually starving them, and they get strangled by holiday lighting that never came down.
Holiday lights are fine on trees, but they shouldn't be put on tightly, and they should be removed right about this time of year.
The citizen pruners are out combing city streets, freeing trees from these binding wires, and spreading the word that city trees create shade, provide oxygen, and even increase property values. Naomi.
Hello, my name is Gerard Lordahl, and I'm director of the Open Space Greening Program at the Council on the Environment of New York City. The time of year is late February, and many of the community gardeners and city gardeners throughout the 5 boroughs are anxious to get started in their garden. February, late February, early March is a good time of the year, or the best time of year, to start some of your seeds indoors to get a jump on the spring gardening season. What I'm going to be talking to you about in the next 30 minutes is some helpful tips, gardening tips, for you to use at home in your own situation, to start some of your flower seeds, to start some of your vegetable plants, so that you'll get a good crop or a good harvest of flowers, whether you have a private backyard garden, whether you're one of the 600 or 700 community gardeners throughout the city, or whether you're just a hobby gardener and would like to try some things indoors for your window box. I have an assortment of materials before you, which include a variety of seed catalogs, seed packets, different types of containers that you could use to sort these seeds, and different types of growing medium that you could use to sort seeds as well. Many gardeners call us and ask for information regarding starting seeds, and we could send you information through the mail, and at the end of this program there will be an address and telephone number that you could call to get further information through the mail or over the telephone. So to begin with, there are 4 major concerns when you're starting seeds indoors, and they are proper water, proper sunlight, proper ventilation or air circulation, and a good temperature. Most of the seeds that I have to show you, and most of the common seeds that are grown in the New York City area, require a germinating temperature of about room temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're interested in growing seeds indoors this time of month, late February, early March, there are certain seeds that you could start now, but you must, before you start to go ahead with your seeding indoors, you have to make sure you'll be able to provide these young seedlings with enough sunlight. You need to have either a southern or an eastern window that gets a fairly decent amount of sunlight. We're talking 6 hours at least of non-obstructed light. So there can't be curtains or heavy shades in front, and some city gardeners, even though they are facing south or east, their window is blocked by a building and it makes it unsuitable for growing plants indoors. So you need to evaluate whether your indoor situation can accommodate seeds. You need to have good sunlight, a southern or an easterly exposure of about 6 hours of direct sunlight. You need to be able to provide a room temperature of about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. You need fairly good ventilation in the room, a window. You need to avoid heavy drafts from radiators or air conditioners or appliances. And you have to be able to keep the seedlings moist. Those 4 things are very important. Along with that is the selection of the container that you'll be using to pot up your seeds. Now, many community gardeners don't have extensive budgets, and they use what's available. Milk cartons, trays, anything that could hold a soil media and also that has drainage. There are also many garden groups that have plastic containers from annual flowers that they purchase from the local nursery, left over from years ago, that they can use as well. Many of us remember in school we would pot up the egg cartons or the milk cartons with soil and start our sunflower seeds or our bean seeds, even containers like coffee cups or aluminum foil or juice containers. All of these things, yogurt cups are very popular as well. All of these things can be used to start your seeds indoors. So in addition to a good container and the right conditions, you also want to make sure of the timing and the crop selection. I'll be talking to you about vegetables as well as flowers. And as I said, this time of year in February, late February and March, the type of flowers you could start easily from seed and that I would recommend would be things like blue ageratum or blue lobelia. We also recommend petunia being planted from seed indoors. And also snapdragon seeds can be started this time of year, and verbena. Those of you who are familiar with those annuals know that they provide you with nice color through the season, way up until frost, and are easy to grow from seed indoors. If you focus on some of the seed packets that I brought, you'll notice that there are a whole variety of seeds, and when I speak of seeds, you want to make sure that your seeds are fresh for this year. you want to buy 1993 packaged seeds. That's very important because you will get a higher percentage of germination. Germination is how the seed will swell once it's given those proper requirements that I mentioned earlier: water, temperature, ventilation. And in the case of seed germinating, it does not require light. You could germinate, you could get your seeds to sprout without light. But temperature is important, and moisture is of utmost importance with good air circulation. So getting back to the seed packet, while you're going through the various seed catalogs that you've been sent through the late winter, you want to make sure that you look for hybrid varieties or varieties of flowers and vegetables that you know do well in the city area. Cooperative Extension provides a list of vegetables in particular that are known to do well in the city area, and you could contact your local extension agent to ask for the varieties that are recommended for the 5 boroughs in New York City. That's vegetables. As far as the varieties of flowers to choose from in your seed catalog, many people go with the All-American variety or the All-American selection for that year of new varieties of zinnias or petunias or snapdragons that have AAS next to the description. Or you could go with the old-time favorites, the seeds that you've selected in the past that have done very well. But make sure that you purchase this year high-quality seeds that will give you the best germination rate. The other consideration about selection is you want to select vegetable seeds in particular that you know your family or your community garden will like. Many gardeners tell us that they have rows and rows of zucchini squash or okra or basil at the end of the season that they have no use for. So keep in mind that one package of seeds has more than enough plants, potential for plants for one family. And one package of tomato seeds is certainly more than enough for one family and is often enough for a whole community garden. So go with recommended varieties, go with fresh seeds that are packed for 1993. You also want to make sure you have a good, sterile, weed and disease, insect-free soil. And it should be a soil-less mix, and that may sound contradictory, but when we refer to a soil-less mix, we're referring to, I brought a sample here in the bucket, a mixture of peat moss, vermiculite, and perlite that does not have your outdoor garden soil in it that often carries disease, insects, and sometimes pathogens that could cause problems for your new seeds. So this is what a good soil mixture would look like, and I brought a sample of it here. You could get it under the name of Cornell Peat-Lite Mix. You could get it under the name of Jiffy Seed Starting Mix. Go to your local nursery and garden center and ask them for a good sterilized seed mixture, and that's what would be recommended, as opposed to going in your backyard and digging up soil and using that to start your seeds. As I said earlier, there are a whole variety of containers that you could use as well when starting your seeds. And I brought a selection of containers. What I'm showing you here next to the peat-lite mix are a variety of peat moss type containers that are biodegradable. So this container here is a peat pot, and this is made of peat moss. It's biodegradable, and you would actually fill that peat pot with your soilless mix or peat-lite mix, and you could start your seeds right in there. They could germinate, you could thin them out, and then you could place the entire peat pot outdoors when the temperature is sufficiently warmed up. That reminds me to inform you, in the New York City area, basically April 20th is considered the frost-free date. That is the date then that we feel that there is less chance or the least chance of a freezing frost. And it's safe for you to put out your warm crop vegetables like your tomatoes, your eggplants, your peppers. There's another type of container that you could use, also made of peat moss, that's sitting right in front of the peat moss pot, or the peat pot, and that's called a Jiffy 7. And a Jiffy 7 pellet is about the size of a small cookie. And what's done is this pellet is placed in a container of water. And many schools will use these Jiffy 7 pellets to start their seeds in the classroom, because the kids have a lot of fun placing these cookie-sized pellets in some warm water and seeing them expand. And as you can see here on the table, I have an already expanded peat pot or Jiffy 7 pellet next to one of the dry Jiffy 7 pellets that have not expanded because they have not absorbed the water. So this is how it would come in the package when you receive them at the garden center. Once it's put in water, it absorbs the water and it expands. All of the peat moss is held within a net that will keep the soil within that net so that it's easy for the plant to grow without the soil shattering. I have a sample here of some lettuce in a Jiffy 7 peat pot that I will place right in front of our original peat pellet so you can see how the germination process occurs in the peat pellet. As you see, this is a black-seeded Simpson seedling of lettuce. That's a loose leaf lettuce that was sown in the Jiffy 7 pellet, and it germinated quite well under artificial light, in fact, fluorescent tubes that were about 12 inches away. And as long as it was provided with enough moisture, the seed germinated. It was warm, it was room temperature, there was enough air ventilation, and this seedling germinated in about 3 weeks to this size. And what can be done at this point is you could continue growing this the lettuce indoors until it's time to put outdoors, which, as I said, should be done after April 19th or 20th. The beauty of the Jiffy 7 pellet and the peat pot is that you don't have to remove the soil from the roots. The whole Jiffy 7 pellet and the whole pot can be placed right in the ground. We also can start our seedlings in a plastic tray that some groups will do, and then transplant the seedlings once they have germinated. This is an overcrowded pot or peat pellet of lettuce as well. And at this point, it's very important that you thin out your seedlings. There's an overabundance of lettuce seedlings in that peat pellet, and if you were to leave that continuous through the season, you would get a very weak crop of lettuce. So what has to be done when you're germinating seeds indoors is that you must be sure to transplant your seedlings. And I'm putting in front of you a small tray of lettuce seedlings that was recently transplanted or thinned out from the larger peat pot, so that each of those little seedlings can develop to a good mature height in that plastic container, and they will be they'll have enough nutrients, they'll have enough water to grow to full healthy size so that you could transplant them outdoors. There's a lot of competition in the peat pot when they're planted and not thinned, and you'll lose a lot of your crop, and it's a waste of time and money. So be sure to thin your seedlings out. A lot of gardeners have trouble doing that. They feel it's a waste. If you have a compost pile or a kitchen compost in your apartment, you could certainly add the thinned out seedlings to that compost pile. In the case of seeded lettuce or basil or parsley, I often use the thinned out seedlings in a salad, and you could eat them right as you're transplanting them if you want. They certainly taste just like regular lettuce or regular basil. So be sure to thin out your seedlings because they can cause problems in overcrowding. That would be the same for flowers as well as vegetables. There are a whole variety of seeds, as you will see when you open up your packets and you purchase them through these various seed catalogs. You'll notice a whole variety of different shapes. On the table, I've brought a selection of seeds, and the very beige, narrow, thin seeds are the lettuce seeds, and the larger, rounded, dark seeds are seeds from a community garden in the Lower East Side of Manhattan at the 6th Street Community Garden, where they grew the loofah gourd. Some of you may know loofah as the sponge that is often used to improve the skin. And those are the seeds of a loofah gourd. And that's another way you can retrieve seeds. You could share seeds among your gardeners, and that's what the community gardens often do. If they have a crop like the loofah gourd, they will package their loofah seed and share them amongst the community gardeners to grow the loofah sponge that you see on the table. It's about the size of a large cucumber or squashed loofah gourd. It is a vine. It's a warm crop, so it cannot go out into the garden until the weather has warmed and the soil has warmed, and usually that's about May 1st. And you need to provide a trellis for it to grow on the vine. Once the fruit is harvested, 90 to 120 days usually, the fruit is then dried, the pulp is scraped off, and inside this squash-type fruit, you would find this loofah sponge that is used, as I said earlier, to remove dead skin, and often in the bath this sponge is used. So you could grow you could start some seeds indoors, not only for flowers like petunias and snapdragons, not only for the fruit like tomatoes and peppers, but also for something like a loofah sponge. So a lot of people will do this indoors. The benefit also economically is that you're paying for one package of seeds to give you dozens of plants, whereas at the garden center you would pay a lot more for 6 or 12 starter seedlings that you would then transplant. However, I do want to caution you again, not everyone can grow seedlings indoors if there is not enough sun, if there is not enough warm temperature, and if they cannot provide a moist environment. Moisture, as I said, is very important. The seeds will only germinate if they're stimulated by moisture. So you must make sure that when you sow the seeds in your sterilized medium, you provide them with constant moisture and humidity. Many people will cover the pot or the container with plastic, clear plastic, that will cause the water to evaporate and condense and to recirculate and keep a high humidity level and also a high water level within the container. I brought a watering atomizer that's a pump sprayer that we find is very easy to water our seedlings with. It's a pump spray, and you could get it in most garden centers, and it has a sort of wand siphoning sort of handle with a tube, and you would simply put pressure in the container by pumping it, and there's a nozzle at the end, and you would just simply press the container, and you could water your Jiffy 7 pellets or your seedlings quite easily. The other importance to something like this is that you're giving a gentle rain to the seedlings. Many times when people water these seedlings, they overwhelm the seedling with large amounts of water and knock the seedling over or cause damage. But this can be adjusted with a very fine spray nozzle that will water your seedlings without causing them damage. And it's also recommended to make sure that you thoroughly moisten the soil that you're working with. When it's new, especially the packaged seed mix, it has a lot of peat moss in it, and the peat moss has a tendency to take a long time to absorb moisture, and that could cause problems for your seedlings. Talking about containers, I also wanted to mention something fairly new on the market. It's called a pot maker. And what you see right here is basically a piece of wood, almost like a mortar and pestle kind of thing, that you'll see in garden catalogs that can help you produce these pots out of discarded newspaper. So we're often talking about recycling and reuse. This pot maker can easily be purchased from the garden center or catalogs, and the way it works is you would cut strips of newspaper about 3.5 inches long and about 3.5 inches wide and about 10 inches long, and you would wrap this piece of newspaper around the wooden sort of dowel, crimping the base as you go along. Making sure that you crimp the base as you're going along the dowel. This is called a pot maker. And then the base is pressed on the bottom of the pot, and sort of like a mortar and pestle kind of thing, you squeeze it and you turn back and forth, putting pressure on it. And what's produced is a newspaper pot, if you will, to start your seedlings in. And you have to make sure that you press it tight enough so that it stays together. We've sown some of our seedlings in these newspaper pots, and here you can see how the newspaper holds together pretty well once it absorbs moisture. So that's something you might want to try out through the seed catalogs that you may have found browsing through the winter. And also you may notice it at your garden center. I also wanted to mention some seeds can be directly sown outdoors and are preferred to be sown directly outdoors in the soil and will not tolerate transplanting. Some of you may have experience with carrots or dill from seed, and once you sow those seeds must remain in that space until maturity and until harvest time. They do not transplant well. So something unlike lettuce, which I just should have talked to you quite a bit about, you could transplant them from the peat pot right into a larger plastic container or outdoors into the garden, and it has no problem. But things like carrots and dill, fennel, they don't transplant well, and many of your seed packages will say that on the back, does not transplant well. That means that where you sow the seed is where the seed must stay, and the plant must stay until harvest time. Also, you should note on the back of your packet some very important information. Some seeds require certain conditions to germinate. Some will say that the seed requires scarification, which means that you need to break an opening on the seed somehow, and that's often done by gently rubbing the seeds on sandpaper. Some seeds, for instance, I once tried germinating water lily seeds. And knowing the history of water lilies, their origin is in the water. They need to germinate overnight, 24 hours, in water. So you need to soak the seeds of things like water lilies. Something more common that some of you might be more likely growing is parsley. Parsley seed also needs to be soaked overnight before it can germinate. And again, germination is the opening up of the seed. A good definition of a seed is a plant in a box with its lunch. We often use that definition when we talk to children in the public schools around New York City about starting seeds. Everything the plant needs, all the nutrition that plant needs, is right in that seed. You just need to provide it with moisture, warmth, good air circulation, and good sunshine to get it going and to develop to its maturity. When we talk about flowering seeds or flower seeds, there are some seeds that are a little more difficult. There are some that are very tiny, like the impatient seeds and the begonia seeds, but they're fairly easy to germinate. This time of year, the ageratum, the lobelia, the petunias, the snapdragons can be started, the verbena. Later on in late March, April, you could start many of your other more common seeds, the geraniums, sunflower seeds, and you could start them indoors and then bring them outdoors when the soil is thoroughly thawed in the month of May. That about wraps it up for this session on starting seeds. I thank you for your attention. And once again, my name is Gerard Lordahl. I'm director of the Open Space Greening Program of the Council on the Environment in New York City. And I welcome any inquiries you might have regarding community gardening, regarding street tree care. And you could call us at the phone number at the end of the program, or you could write to our office right here in Manhattan. Happy gardening.